Well, let me introduce a friend, a colleague, a fellow faculty member from MST, Andrew Brown. Andrew, how many years have you been at MST now?
12 and a half.
12 and a half, yeah, so a little longer than I've been there, so quite a bit longer than I've been there, 8 years. So, and you lecture in Old Testament. What got you interested in Old Testament?
Well, I think I was interested in biblical studies, and I could have gone for either testament, but when I started to express that interest to the people instructing me up at the Bible college I was at in Queensland, they were suggesting that actually there were basically fewer people out there doing Old Testament, and therefore a more realistic prospect of actually getting work doing that in Australia.
Yeah, some of it's really practical, isn't it? Yeah, I'd like a job at the end of this. So, yeah. So you've been lecturing before you were a lecturer in Old Testament. What'd you do before that?
I really didn't do anything very significant before that. I'd worked in Christian camping, and I'd been doing sort of low-level Bible teaching. I did New Testament and some Greek teaching at a little Bible college, and worked in food service and did lots of study,
All those various things. And you spent a few years in the United States. You did a little bit of study there, and so we catch up on his experiences of life in the United States, and it's always interesting to hear about your country from another person, through their eyes. Yeah, so good. Well, thank you, Andrew. I will pray for you, and I figured, having a series in the book of Nehemiah, it would be nice to hear from an Old Testament lecturer and some of his thoughts as we come into this next section, chapter 10 of Nehemiah. So let me pray for you. Father, I do thank you for your word, for your spirit that has inspired the giving of the word and who also enlightens the understanding of the word. So I pray for Andrew as he opens this text today. Thank you for his attentiveness to your spirit and his attentiveness to the word. And so, Father, speak through him, teach us, guide us, help us, and form us more into the image of Christ because of what we will hear today. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, I think we all learned something a little bit before there. If you let Tom bring you up the front, you get thrown into ministry faster than you're probably ready for. So just don't be afraid, to occasionally come up into the front rows despite that. It's interesting, we're talking about commitment this morning, aren't we? So my wife's come with me this morning, Naomi, and we've been here once or twice before, and I actually have an uncle in the suburb as well, an uncle and aunt here in Eltham. But Naomi's been waking up in the mornings with worry dreams about our children. And, dreams, I'm not always convinced that they send us messages, but they do indicate what's on our minds. And if we're worrying about our kids and their future, for those of us in my age band, that will probably tend to sit on the mind all night, and you'll worry about what kind of partner they're going to end up with, and will they be employed, and will they just game for their whole life? And so these are the sorts of things that you can wake up thinking about in the morning. But there was a time when Naomi had a bit of a scary parent moment that was a waking one. And it was probably about 10 years ago. So I'd say our kids, who are now 20, 18 and 16, were probably more than 10 years younger than that. They were probably in single digits. And Naomi and her mum were taking them to the city for the day, and we're at the train station. I think it was Bayswater train station down near us. And the train doors opened, and so they got all the kids on board, and they were just getting ready to get on board themselves when the doors shut. And I think it was only Naomi's mum sticking on. No, it was someone. No, they didn't. They didn't stop them leaving. It was just that we had friends on board the train. Got it arranged. No, I'm getting the story wrong. This has never happened before. Yeah, jammed in the door. Yeah. But we had a friend on board as well, didn't we? Yeah, that's right. So this is the good thing about having students at Bible college, because we actually had one of my Bible college students on the train by chance, by providence, who would have looked after our kids. But they nearly left on the train without the parents. And a mother's heart skips a little beat when that kind of thing happens. But you can't really be half on a train, right? You can't half take a train ride to a neighbouring station. It's kind of a committing thing. When the train starts to move or the doors start to close, you've got to decide which of those feet you're going to trust, the foot that's on the platform or the foot that's in the train. Are you actually going to leave or stay? And we face lots of these kinds of situations. You'll see people on the freeway thinking about whether they should exit or not, and there's just this point where you've got to decide because that concrete barrier that's shaped like a triangle forces you to go left or right. And I'm an armchair surfer. You probably haven't heard of that sport before, but I do that one. And in Western Australia, there's what they call the heaviest wave in Australia. Any other armchair surfers here? Yeah, see, I told you, I'm a pioneer. But this particular wave, there's a reef in WA, and WA catches lots and lots of heavy swell. It's exposed to the whole Southern Ocean, the Indian Ocean, so it gets lots of swell. And this wave hits this reef, and when the swell really turns on, it just pitches over like a great big cliff. And if you want to see great wipeout videos, just search on The Right, capital letters, and probably WA or Western Australia, and you'll see some of the heaviest wipeouts you can ever imagine. And one that sticks in my mind, the surfers were being towed in. I think I need new ears for this arrangement. The surfers were being towed in. Oh, I can hear myself now. And, with jet skis. And so the surfer was on this one really substantial wave, I'd say about 2.5 stories high. And if you time it right, you can actually get off the wave. And this guy, I think, had decided that he wasn't going to go for this one. And so he was working his way up to the top of the wave. But this wave hits the reef so hard that you don't have long to make such a decision. And so as his board works its way to the top of the wave, he was losing his balance off the back of the board. He was trying to get off the back of the lip, but he didn't manage because his balance was gone. And he fell off the back of his board and basically free fell 2 stories to the bottom of the wave to then go through the punishment that follows. So it's unforgettable to watch, and I'm sure it'd be pretty unforgettable to experience. So it's not a bad kind of symbol of the way that a lot of the experiences in our lives force us to decide. I think culturally we have a reservation about being committed, and we like to keep our options open. And I know I do, You like to think, well, there's an opportunity to do something on the weekend, but you'd like to just tell the people involved on the night before whether you're going to come or not, Keep those options open. We seem to prefer that. But many things in life, many of the most important things, actually force you to resolve what it's going to be. And so our passage today in Nehemiah 10 is really one about finding that resolve. And I don't know whether Tom realises that, I suppose having worked through Nehemiah to this point, he must realise that he's really kind of given me the climactic passage in the whole of Ezra and Nehemiah. He's kind of given me the best bit. So the 2 books are really fundamentally one book, but they are about 2 characters and kind of 2 phases of recovery life in the return from exile for the community of Jews that comes back from Babylon. And in a way, the recovery begins before Ezra because he only appears in chapter 7 of Ezra. So you've got 6 chapters of this recovery story, starting with the decree of the Persian Emperor Cyrus to let the Jews, and apparently empire-wide, that was policy for other peoples, let them return to their native lands, reconstruct their temples and re-establish their forms of worship. So it wasn't purely for Judah or Judea that this was happening, but it gave them an opportunity in the providence of God to go home from Babylon if they were willing and get started recovering. And so we have 6 chapters of Ezra before Ezra's actual arrival, where this recovery is underway and they establish an altar. And then with the impulse of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, they are able to actually rebuild the temple. And so on the most common dating of how that probably happened, the temple was rebuilt within about 20 years of return. So Ezra actually only came along kind of about 70 years later, a good couple of generations in the mid-5th century. And his task was, like temple reconstruction, a spiritual recovery task, but his responsibility was to establish and implement the law. And this was Persian policy. They actually wanted a degree of local autonomy so that the local people would live under laws that they understood, and it would have a religious element, kind of so that they would be functional and happy rather than always looking for the opportunity to rebel. And so Ezra had that kind of authorization to establish the law, and he could draw on all of Israel's law. So this was a chance to get reacquainted with God, really, in the formal structures of Jewish law. When we come to the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah comes similarly with Persian authorization. And first of all, he oversees the reconstruction of the physical boundary of the wall. It's interesting because Ezra 7 talks about the law as a kind of a wall, but now Nehemiah comes to re-establish a physical wall, and that of course means that the city has a future of some self-determination and defensibility, so they actually have the chance to build some political strength. But Nehemiah, as Ezra's sole job wasn't to make sure that the temple structure was sound, but that the spiritual infrastructure of the nation was sound, Nehemiah's job didn't stop with the physical structure of the wall, but he really had the job of making sure that the nation was politically and civilly functional, right? Functioning as a just society. So we notice that there's another commitment moment earlier in the book in Nehemiah 5, that's probably fairly fresh in the mind, where Nehemiah had to say and confront the community and say, what you're doing here where you're accumulating debt bonds from your fellow citizens and then holding them to account and essentially holding them in a form of indefinite slavery, that's incompatible with the kind of covenant life that we're aspiring to reconstruct here. So those of you who are getting wealthy by gathering together the debt obligations of other people and essentially holding them in bonded servitude, that is not covenant life, and it's got to stop. So there was practical action needed. So Nehemiah is not just looking after a physical structure, he's looking after the moral and civil infrastructure of the nation. We just don't, not in the New Testament, not in the Old Testament, do we have a situation where you can live exploitatively and, in an irreverent way, but then rock up to religious ceremonies and please God with that appearance kind of once a week. There's got to be a consistency for our spiritual integrity to work. So the very last thing that we read in chapter 9, and I've got this on a second device because I don't know if I can trust getting out of chapter 10 on my main one. This is how that prayer finishes. So here we're kind of in the climactic zone where the writer wants to say the reconstructive role, the leadership role of Ezra and Nehemiah, they're both converging in these three chapters, chapters 8 to 10, which will be quite fresh on your mind, no doubt. And so chapter 8 has this gathering to hear the law. So Ezra seems well grounded in the law, but the common person doesn't know a great deal about it, and it has to be read out. And then because they've come back home from Babylon speaking a different language, not speaking Hebrew anymore, it actually probably has to be translated into Aramaic and then the sense of it explained. And they stand there for hours for this. Sometimes when we read about long church services or even contemplate the prospect of one, sometimes we quail a little bit. I was, for my research for a recent book, studying the Westminster Assembly, which happened in England in the Republic years in the middle of the 1600s. And the Westminster Assembly, I remember reading one day of its meeting was a 2-hour sermon, a 1-hour prayer time, another 2-hour sermon, another 1-hour prayer time, and another 2-hour sermon. That was the bulk of the day's proceedings. And I did read in other parts of the document complaints about attendance dropping a little bit as the Westminster Assembly went on, So if ever you feel hard done by, just contemplate that kind of day of worship and everything else will look fantastic by comparison. But on this day, they stand there for 4 hours and gladly, because what they're doing is they've been hungry for some sign of the word and the will of God, and now they have some access to it. So that's a very significant day. They discover that the Feast of Tabernacles has been a thing and that they could do it again. And so in the same month, they reconvene to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And then there's this great penitential prayer in chapter 9. And some of the commentaries I was reading insist that it's Ezra's prayer, but actually you can't find Ezra's name anywhere in the chapter, and he doesn't even seem involved. The Levites lead the prayer in chapter 9. So it's a tough job working out the order of historical events in relation to the book, but all we really need to do for our purposes is understand the order of events in the book. So the prayer finishes like this, and you might remember these words. This is how the prayers conclude by saying to God, after reflecting on all their spiritual history, where we are right now is not where we're trying to be, because we're not enjoying the benefits of the covenant promises, the covenant life that you've promised to us. So verse 36 of chapter 9 says, "So today we are slaves. In the very land you gave to our ancestors to eat its fruit and to enjoy its good things, we are slaves. Its abundant produce goes to the kings you've placed over us due to our sins. They rule over our bodies and our livestock as they see fit, and we're in great distress." I'm reading the Net Bible, by the way. And so here we come to a point where the chapter division falls in a different spot in the Hebrew and the English, and actually I kind of like where it is in the Hebrew. So there's this moment of covenant making is initiated. In the Hebrew Bible, this is the first verse of chapter 10. In your Bible, our Bible, it's the last verse of chapter 9. "Because of all this, we are entering into a binding covenant in written form. Our leaders, our Levites, and our priests have affixed their names on the sealed document." Ezra and Nehemiah is all about documentation, right? You can tell that it's been written by government officials. Everything gets written down or read from a document. It's really important to have things in writing and not just verbally in Ezra and Nehemiah. And the word for covenant here, interestingly, is not the normal one used throughout the Old Testament. There's this particular one we get very used to seeing when we study the Old Testament, and it's not this. This is super rare. This only happens twice in the Bible, both in Nehemiah. And maybe if I was translating the Bible, maybe I would use a different word to establish the distinction there, but something like a pledge or a commitment, a bond, some word like that. But it's in the family of the idea of covenant. And so they're signing up to this. They're putting their names down, and then some of the best devotional reading available in the Bible follows in the next 26, 27 verses, with things like Sariah, Azariah, Jeremiah, Pasha, Amariah, Malchijah, Hattush, Shebaniah, and so forth. You're a bit worried I was going to read them all out, weren't you? I did have a bit of a poke around to, who these people were and what they'd done. Do we know anything else about them? The dominant pattern is that each of these is usually mentioned somewhere else in the books. And so there are patches where there's reason to mention lists of priests. There are patches where there's reason to mention Levites, and patches where civil leaders, kind of more secular leaders, have reason to be mentioned. And so it's interesting where they are. So in our list, we have first of all the priests down to verse 8. Then we have the Levites, verses 9 to 13, and then we have the civil leaders, 14 to 27. And we see these names in places like, for the civil leaders, especially the building of Nehemiah's wall in chapter 3. We'll see some of these names a little bit earlier when Ezra is gathering priests and Levites to come across from Babylon. When he gathers his original team, and then when he discovers he's short on Levites and gathers an extra group with a second recruiting drive, we see many of those names. And we actually see some of the names that are associated with Zerubbabel back in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. Now, the fact that we see in some cases individual names in series that are identical or nearly identical, even as far back as Ezra 2 and here, shows that some of these names are clan representative names and not individual names. If you want to make a study of which ones is which, you can take that further than I really did. But it turns out, because some of them stay the same across a 70-year span of time, it's clear that they are the names of clans or families. And those family names keep coming up. Even embarrassingly, you could say, some of the people whose names appear in this list, members of those clans, have been caught in their intermarriage situation in Ezra chapter 10 and having to renounce those marriages. It's a difficult chapter, that one. Maybe you worked through that one as well. But it sort of shows that we're dealing with the same community, and even within these clans who here in this chapter are making commitments that include not to intermarry, Ezra 10 has already seen these clans having to try and painfully undo some of the compromises that have already been made back then. So this is very official, it's very accountable. You write your name on a document, it's very easy for people to check whether you did or not, right? This has all the marks of covenant with the public accountability, the fact that everybody knows. You know, when I was practicing as a pastor, I did about 7 weddings and 7 funerals from memory. And because already we're in a time when people were bothering to get married less, I often went through my mind, how would I explain to someone who was happy not being married, a couple happy not being married, why actually being publicly married was a good idea. And one of the main things that came to me was just that you are making yourself publicly accountable. So if you're kind of in a de facto relationship, you can sort of, people will get to know, but if you've been married in a ceremony, you've stood up the front with all the people you know best, all your friends, all your family present, and you've explicitly made your promises to stay with this person. So it's committing. It's like being on the right, the wave at the right, and deciding you are going down in and you're not pulling off the back of the lip. It's a real watershed moment. And you stand to lose face if you obviously were unfaithful and careless with that relationship. So it's scarier making those covenantal flag planting occasions, but it actually improves the quality of what you commit yourself to. You realise, wow, I've really signed on here. I'm on the train, and this is an on the train moment. And so these groups are summed up in 28-29 as publicly entering into this covenant, and even there's a curse mentioned in 29. So this is where in this culture, you would invoke on yourself a curse if you didn't complete your part of the promise. Now, we've all sat in committee meetings, and maybe some of you have watched Utopia and there's been committee meetings on there. The kind of meeting that you have where everyone's getting along and they're agreeing and everything like that, and you walk out the door, and a couple of days later, no one's remembered to actually do anything. But the only time you find that out is when you convene for the next meeting of that committee, and you go through the agenda and you realise it strongly resembles the preceding agenda because there's been no progress. No one actually took any action points out and remembered to do anything. The bigger the committee, the more likely this is. But this is why we need those people on committees who say, as everyone's sort of getting fatigued and getting ready to leave, someone will sometimes say, hey, so what are you actually going to do? You know, who said that they would do this? And they sort of hold people to some action points. So this is an action point passage. It's kind of good intentions in 28 and 29, but we don't get to wrap the chapter up there because it's going to follow with practicalities. There are 5 things that they commit themselves to, and then one of the 5 has 5 subpoints. And then one of those has... No. So the first thing they commit themselves to in verse 31 is, we will not buy on the Sabbath, this is the second thing. First thing, off the top of my screen, verse 30, will not give our daughters in marriage to the neighbouring peoples, and will not take their daughters in marriage for our sons. This sounds preventative here, as if it's not right in the same situation as Ezra 10 was, where they were trying to painfully undo the damage that was done. Here it seems designed to prevent, and it's stated very briefly. It's it's a bit of a harsh measure in some ways, isn't it? A bit hard, particularly the undoing in Ezra 10. But anytime we do commit to something, it usually involves committing not to other things, right? So when you do go through a wedding ceremony, you really have resolved that you're cutting off all other options, right? You're closing every other relational door to that degree of intimacy because you're opening this one properly. It's similar with lots of commitments. You know, if you committed yourself to a political party, you're really promising that you're not going to work for the opposition parties, for the rival parties. So all of these serious commitments involve choices not to, as well as choices to. The second one, verse 31, will not buy on the Sabbath or on a holy day from the neighbouring peoples who bring their wares and their grain to sell on the Sabbath. And then the next one's the third one. So this second one, this begins to show that we're going to have a kind of a contrary relationship with chapter 13. So I won't anticipate too many of the things in chapter 13, except this list we're going through will be things that the people are failing to do by the end of the book. So I don't know, it'll be interesting to know what Tom's strategy for preaching Nehemiah is, because chapter 13 risks being a bit of a downer in some ways. But this is what covenant making is like. We know when we get married, we know when we make a commitment to an organisation or take a new job, we know that we don't know the future. We know that we don't know what it's entirely going to be like in that situation. We know that we don't know for sure if we're going to enjoy it, or if it's going to be what we signed up for, or whether we'll be tempted to disillusionment. We don't know what it's going to be like. You don't get married knowing everything about what that relationship's going to be like. And so covenant making doesn't wait for the moment when you have perfect clarity and absolute certainty. It can't wait that long. Be waiting all of our lives for all the important decisions. I mean, maybe you're that kind of person who gets that miraculous kind of clarity at these moments, but I'm not. I just have to take a step. And so chapter 13 does remind us that chapter 10's moment of commitment couldn't be done with absolute certainty of the ability to fulfill it, or what that experience would be like, or whether not trading on the Sabbath was going to cost them, financially. But there's a definite move to put the temptations of materialism and commerce in second place here, and say, look, money is not going to rule this civil community. Money is not going to rule this covenant group. It is not the highest priority. It can't determine what's best, and it's not going to be the measure of all good things in our society. I think we have to keep doing that too. So one thing about us having, I'm a Paul fan, Apostle Paul. And so whenever things start to get legalistic, I get really nervous, and I can hear Paul saying in my ear, grace not works, and gospel not law. I never forget Paul. But I can see how a principle like the Sabbath is good in some way to be implemented in our lives, because stopping and not doing, money-earning work every day of the week is a way for us to recall it doesn't all depend on me, right? My prosperity depends on God. It's not how much I can earn, and it's not just by working more and more hours that I get my security, right? So by stopping, I remember, hey, actually, this is God's job to keep me alive and keep my family fed and keep us in our house. And if God can't do it, there's no use me working 7 days to achieve that goal, right? Stopping is trusting, right? So some kind of Sabbath principle in our lives, and makes sense in a lot of ways if it's the day we come to church, but it doesn't have to be, Paul would say, is a way of getting our priorities right, saying, look, it's not about the buying and selling and about the money. I feel for you people who have your own businesses, because that must be the hardest of all. It's very hard to go home from your own business, but we've got to do this. Commitment number 3 is part of the same verse. We'll let the fields lie fallow every 7th year. This really kind of sounds like the 3 and 4 here, now that I read it again. We'll let the fields lie fallow every 7th year, and we'll cancel every loan. The fields lying fallow is something that's built into the law, as early as Exodus 23, I think it is. But as a farmer, you can imagine how much commitment that took to actually not cultivate your land 1 year in 7. Right? There are scholars who think this was never implemented, or barely ever, in Old Testament Israel, because it's so hard to actually do. And maybe it had to be done on a rotating basis, so it wasn't the whole country all at once. But it still is a stop for materialism and material prosperity, even to the point of really having to trust God for your food supply in an agricultural society. And the last point in that verse, cancelling every loan, this word loan seems to have a special meaning here. It seems to not just be, debt cancellation, the way it's built into Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but it actually seems to be a special word for not accumulating others' debt obligations and trading those things. Like, maybe it's having watched The Big Short. I don't know if anyone ever watched the movie The Big Short about the financial crisis and credit default swaps. I think that put that phrase, credit default swaps, into my head. It didn't really occur to me before that along with buying assets from other people, you could actually buy other people's debt from other people. And pretty soon the movie lost me there, even though they tried very carefully to explain it. But the whole financial crisis, one big aspect of what was going on was people were buying other people's hopeless debt. And then some people would really benefit if the debt did prove hopeless and it couldn't be fulfilled. So there's actually a special word being used right at that spot in this verse that seems to be about buying other people's debt obligations, and that accumulating those was, again, a violation of how covenant life was meant to work in the nation. When we come to 32 down to really all the way down to 38 or so, it's all the fifth point about maintaining temple life. And it's various aspects. It's maintaining the food supply, it's maintaining the wood supply so the fire could keep burning, it's bringing tithes, it's bringing first fruits, it's bringing another kind of first fruits. So there's two different words. One seems to be for the front end of your harvest, and another word seems to be for the best of your harvest. It goes all the way to the first fruits of your fruit, which funnily enough doesn't appear in the law at all. Okay, that the idea of actually bringing the best first production of your fruit trees is over and above the requirements of the law. And several of these things prove to be. They have a connection to some law in the first 5 books, in the Torah, but they actually take it further and make it more demanding, strikingly. And so the gist of this is, if the temple is going to function, we actually need people bringing their first fruits. The tithes and the first fruits, the Levites, when it comes to tithing here, the Levites get the tithe and then they take a tithe of their tithe and pass it on to the priests. So I would understand that the priests, are roughly 1/10 in number of the Levites, that the Levites are the workers and the kind of all the support staff of the temple, and then the priests do the highest and holiest of the work there, and that the tithes sustain both of these groups. And so there's actually tithing regulation and first fruits regulation in this little text that's more detailed than in any other part of the Old Testament. It was probably an important precedent text. But the practical reality of the situation was, if people didn't maintain their part, keep their spot on the roster, bring the wood when it was their turn, bring the food when it was their turn, bring that portion of their harvest that the Jewish law, that the biblical law obliged them to, the whole system risked falling down. And so if we needed an illustration of that, we see it in Nehemiah 13, because that's the core problem of what goes wrong in Nehemiah 13, is that Nehemiah comes back from Persia and 90% of the Levites are out farming properties around Jerusalem because nobody was bringing them any food, right? And the system was not being maintained, so it was in collapse. So I kind of think of like a military situation. I sometimes enjoy reading battle stories. I read a book on the, Operation Barbarossa not too long ago, and you really get an impression how grueling battle situations are. But when things get hard and people start to melt away and units look for chances to defect or surrender to the other side, you can imagine a bunch of soldiers looking around at each other and sort of with a question in their minds, so who's staying here, If enough of us stand our ground and rally, we can fight this fight. But if everyone keeps sort of sneaking off behind trees and disappearing, I can't fight this alone. I really have a lot of sympathy for Saul in 1 Samuel 13, when his troops are melting away and kind of hiding, and Samuel hasn't turned up to conduct the sacrifice that's supposed to start the battle, and he's not allowed to start till Samuel turns up. And he's a bit late, and so Saul flinches and offers the sacrifice himself. I have some sympathy for Saul, because I just imagine, you're facing 20,000 Philistines and you're down to 600 men and everyone else is shaking in their shoes. It's a panicking situation. It's a panicky scenario to be left like that. But if everyone will stand, or at least a good core will stand, you can make it. If enough people will sort of say, well, all right, I have to stand and kind of die on this piece of ground, if that's what it takes, because someone's got to know that I'm not leaving. And so my fellow soldiers, I'm nailing my colours to the mast here and saying, fellow soldiers, I'll be here. Who else is going to stay? I'll be here. And if that means that not enough of you stay and I die, well, I've made that decision. Right? That's the kind of commitment that's needed. So if they all shared responsibility, this temple worship could be sustained even though the community was struggling. If everybody played their part, it could be done. And so you get that conclusion at the end, we will not neglect the temple of our God. So look, Aussies are practical people, right? We sort of know when we're committed and when we're not. There are obvious signs of commitment. There are signs of putting our money where our mouth is, of showing up when things are on, of just pulling our weight. I don't know if you've ever carried a super, super heavy picnic table, like one of those solid timber things that weighs about 200 kilos. There's some weird law of physics about those tables where you can have 6 people on it, but someone's carrying about 500 grams, and then on another corner, someone's carrying 50 kilos. So I don't know what it is, how physics goes nuts with picnic tables, but if enough people will stay on the table, it can be carried. If enough people will keep their part, but if too many people flee, right, your picnic table is going to be standing there. It's going to be stuck where it lies. So I notice a few things about what starts out as a fairly drab list of names we don't recognise and ends with Jewish law commitments that don't really apply to us anymore. And some of those observations that those commentators have made where they've noticed that these commitments, A, go beyond the law in lots of ways, and B, are quite distinctive compared to the law. Like there's a specificity about them that you don't find back in the Pentateuch. And so this commitment is tailored to the situation. It's not just a rereading of some laws from Exodus or Deuteronomy. It's tailored to the situation. They're reading what is needed on the ground, and they're certainly acknowledging the authority of the Word of God. Like you won't find the phrase law of Moses more frequently anywhere else in the Old Testament than Ezra and Nehemiah. So there's a strong reverence for the law of God now in written form. Like previously, much of the reference to the law is probably referred to oral law before the exile, but now it's documented, it's written out, and people know where to find it. They know Ezra can access it. And so there's a strong reverence for the written word of God, but its implementation is tailored to the actual situation. They have looked around them, they've looked at how the temple's going to work, and they have implemented aspects here that are not explicitly written in the law. Offering the first of your actual fruit, that's not in the law. The specificity of how the tithe works and how the first fruit works goes beyond the law in some cases. So it's tailored to the situation. 100 years later, 100 years earlier, it wouldn't work the same. The law couldn't be in this detail. It couldn't run the same way. So there's tailoring to the situation, and there's a kind of a deep commitment that where everyone's really laying it on the line to make it happen, even beyond what the law required. But also, there was this sense of having to take the risk of not knowing if you could sustain it. I don't think the final message of the book is that they couldn't and that it was unrealistic. Nehemiah has to come and resuscitate it, but it is doable. It is doable. It's just that commitment can wane over time. When I was pastoring, I remember a lady getting in touch with me and she said, I'd like to start a prayer meeting at your church. And I said, I'm open to that, but would you like to come along to the prayer meeting that we already have? No, she didn't. So it's always kind of more exciting to start something than sustain the thing that you started last year or 5 years ago, right? It just doesn't look as sensational. You can learn that from Utopia as well. It's much more fun announcing a new program than actually funding and maintaining it for several years. So I think we have to be much more resilient about the kind of the difficult, unsensational work of just sustaining things that we did start, if they're of value. Sometimes we discover that there are things we started and they've outlived their usefulness and the situation's changed and we just don't really need them anymore. But I admire people who can recognise the value in something that was someone else's great idea and started years ago Still has its value, still helps people, still contributes to the life of the church, and so they know how to be a stayer and how to keep it going. Don't always need the headline of a new announcement and a new start. So that's the kind of persistence that was required in this kind of situation. The people fell short in chapter 13, but it was possible. The message of the book, I can't believe that the message of the book is that it wasn't possible. I think that the message is that it wasn't done for a period there. But it's good to realise that there's that risk of non-completion. So I like the practicality even of just showing up to church, because it says to our society, like, I'm still on the team. It's not that I never have doubts about my faith. It's not that I never have doubts about the way the church functions, nationally or internationally, or that I'm proud of the Pope, or that I love what the Australian church has been known for in the past. But when it comes down to it, despite my doubts and reservations, I've had to decide whether to get on the train or not. I'm on the train. And the other passengers can know that I'm on the train. Even on the days when I'm struggling, or when my relationships on the train aren't going well, or whatever, you can just name me a passenger. I'm on the passenger list, my name's down there, I'm accountable, I'm known, I'm here, right? I'll be here, and if it ends in a train wreck, I'll ride the train to the end. Because it actually needs some people committed enough to go to the train wreck to actually keep the train going. Many times it doesn't end up in a wreck, but it needs the stayers to know who's on board. So this is a high point in the book. This is a really significant moment. Chapter 11 is about who's going to live in the city to make sure the city works. That's calling on the commitment that was made here for people to live in a difficult situation for a while. It was hard being in Jerusalem in a food-growing, sustained society, right? It took people with commitment. In chapter 12, it's got the commitment ceremony with the music and the dance and the ceremony around the city. And then chapter 13 is just the thought provoker to finish. So this is really the high point of commitment for all of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is the returned society who've got their temple working, their worship and law working, and their city walled, but now saying, well, I'm willing to have my name on the list. I'm willing to be known as a stayer, and I may or may not always get along with the other people whose names are on the list, and in fact they'll have their struggles, as you can tell from the book, but my name's down. So I can be unclear about my faith sometimes, but I'm very clear on the fact that I signed up and I meant it when I did, and I don't really mind who knows that my name's on the list. I'm a Christian, I'm a Jesus person, and that's my attitude to the end. So in a practical society like Australia, I think that faith commitment is most naturally associated with the commitment to sort of be helping God's people in the place that you've chosen to gather with them and sustain the energy that happens there. And Paul said, look, when he was gathering, and I close with this, when he was gathering the collection to take back to Jerusalem in Corinthians there, he asks them to be generous, but he says the point here is not that you be burdened and other people have an easy time of it, but that there be an equality. And he quotes that passage about the manna, right? The people who gathered a lot didn't have too much. The people who didn't gather much still had enough. And so Paul says that's the principle in the Christian community. It's not that some people are doing more than they can carry and then others are having an easy ride. It's that we spread the load so that each person does what they can do and doesn't do what they can't. So I actually think there's no guilt when you're offered a church role and this will just about break me if I take this on along with the other things that I'm responsible for, then you shouldn't, right? Because the principle is not that you be crushed. The principle is that everybody takes their corner of the picnic table and together it goes somewhere, okay? So I don't really know much about your church, but I just know that what a Christian community takes to run. And so please try and encourage those people who are visibly the stayers, visibly the really committed ones. Help them to lighten their load sometimes and encourage them that they're seen, and together it can be done. So let me close in prayer, my part, and then I'll hand over. Lord, we know that you've got your ordinary people who are deeply committed, and they're not always the people up in the podium and up in the front. We know that there are people in hidden corners who very faithfully do what you've asked them to do. They sustain a children's ministry, or they sustain a visitation ministry, or they sustain a tech system, and they show up and they do the work, and sometimes it hurts and costs them, and sometimes they're up early and they're tired. Lord, we praise you for those people, the stayers, the people on the train, and they inspire us to be consistent and be better. And so, Lord, in our hearts we want to join them and stand side by side and just let them know that we too are willing to pull some of the weight as well. You don't ask us to pull more than we can pull. You ask us to pull what we can pull. And so by your grace, help us to all contribute and find the load not too heavy, because everyone's taking a bit of it. Lord, encourage the church as the series on Nehemiah continues, and help Tom as he preaches and leads through that. And I just pray that the whole series would be a real boost and a shot in the arm for the vine. Amen.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew.